I'm so happy to be here today with our panelists. As Jeffrey said, we're going to take it from here and shift a little bit from the past to the future, trying to activate our spatial and political imaginations. So urban planners, as we know, are supposed to anticipate the future consequences of decisions and policy interventions in the present. We're supposed to consider the probable, the plausible, and the possible. We teach our students how to scan the horizon, how to develop scenarios and forecasts, and analyze trends. But what is the role of the planner? To just accept those trends? What kind of agency or power do we have to steer and influence those trends? So we've assembled you all, a group of creatives, astute observers, and active participants in the life of Chicago, to share your thoughts about Chicago's collective future. So we have to my right, my wonderful colleague, Nick Theodore, in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy. Nick is a UIC Distinguished Professor and the Director of the Center for Urban Economic Development. We also have with us Marissa Navarra, who is Vice President of Community Impact for the Chicago Community Trust and former Commissioner of Housing for the City of Chicago. And you both are illustrious graduates of our many programs in the department. We have with us Nina Itamudia, who is CEO of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, who is also former Recovery Plan Director for the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, and the first Black president for the Illinois chapter of the American Planning Association. Woo! And last but not least, we have with us Ayana Contreras, author of the amazing book, Energy Never Dies, Afro-Optimism and Creativity in Chicago, producer and host of Reclaimed Soul on Vocalo Radio, which we can talk about, and also the DJ for our wonderful party tonight, and I hope you will not miss it. Ayana is going to be spinning some tunes from 1973, the year our program was developed, which was also a particularly robust year for music, if I may say so myself. So the first topic that I'd like us to discuss a little bit are these trends, so to speak. So I asked my students, and you know who you are, this semester, to come up with some future scenarios. And the scenarios they came up with sounded a little bit like a dystopian science fiction novel, right? We've got dramatic weather events increasing because of climate change. We've got war, genocide, and economic deprivation continuing and forcing migration to and from cities like Chicago. We've got an economy that is restructuring, whether it's AI or sort of platforms that will certainly have major transformative effects on labor markets. We see a constant stream of new technologies that could both enhance our lives but also upend them. And then we see politics being increasingly polarized and polarizing, especially along the lines of class, gender, and race. What do you think of this future? Is it as dystopian as my students think it is going to be? Think a little bit about the trends, especially that will affect your particular areas of expertise: labor, culture, the environment, housing, and neighborhoods. When you project these areas that you care so passionately about into the future, what do you see? And whoever would like to start, Nina, you're looking at me, so
yeah, I'll start. That's fine. Well, the thing about the future, and it's funny that your students or people may consider those things to be a little bit dystopian. Part of the future, especially for Black and brown folks, I'm from the East Side of Detroit. I grew up in a certain environment, and I've always thought about the future. Like, that has been something consistent and that's what led me to planning, is because I've always kind of been thinking about a future that was not, but a future that I wanted. And I think for the Center of Neighborhood Technology, our 45-year history has been set on a future that we want, but we don't currently have, and we've always been working towards that. Back in 1975, when our founder Scott had this wild and crazy idea to, put green rooftops in North Lawndale, or, in the 1990s when Jackie Grimshaw brought car sharing to Chicago and we created iGo. Like, these are futures that we've been trying to get to, and I think we're primed and ready with this kind of new generation. I'm peak millennial. I was born in 1990, and then, Generation Z, I think now we're at a generation that's ready for it and saying, like, yes, that is the future that we want, and we're going to collectively work towards it, instead of like going up a hill and having people tell us, no, it's not possible. And so I think the future that we're kind of working towards, again, has already kind of been in our foresight for some of our communities, for many of the communities that you will eventually be working in. And it's just about bringing those ideas and the opportunity and actually making it actionable. And that's what I think is beautiful about the future of Chicago.
Great.
I'll jump in too, Rachel. I want to pick up off of what Nina said, because I think our fields, broadly speaking, are ones where we have to deal with a pretty crushing reality and yet still get up out of bed every morning and figure out what we do have the power to make better. And that can be a really hard line. It's a pretty narrow one many times, but as someone who was faced with a 120,000 unit affordable housing gap in Chicago, and yet you're asked to come up with solutions that mean something in people's lives. And I think so. Thinking in the future, I think about the things that we have learned the hard way and what we already know and just need to enact, right? So some of those things are, we have now for 11 years in the city of Chicago had a transit-oriented development ordinance, which says that we think and use land differently that's right near transit. We don't need to relitigate that every time there's an opportunity for development near a transit station, right? We have already agreed on those principles: more density, more affordability, less parking. And the cool thing is you actually can, even in a condition of scarcity, really change things dramatically. Because when we worked and did a study with Elevated Chicago on where transit-oriented developments had gone from 2013 to 2019, what we found was that 90% of them were on the north side, in the Loop or the West Loop, as if there weren't abundant transit options on the south and west side and abundant land to build upon in those areas. So in my tenure at the city, we took a pretty dramatic shift both in what we funded and in changing legislation to make that different. So in a funding round in 2021, 18 of our 24 developments were on the south and west side near transit. And I think you can, even in conditions of scarcity, say that's what we do going forward and into the future.
So you can reverse trends.
Yes.
Ayanna, Nick?
So what had happened was, it's really interesting because I keep thinking about the pandemic when I had a lot of friends who, for various reasons, moved to New York. And during the pandemic, they moved away from New York, and I would ask them why. And why they said what they said was, without the culture, the math didn't make sense anymore. Now, what we're seeing right now is that people have not returned to our downtown, and there is not the investment in culture that I would sometimes like to see. But the thing that, if nobody ever comes downtown again for work, what draws people to cities, what keeps people from moving away from urban centers in a lot of ways is quality of life. One of those things is access to transit, right? The amenities on the boulevard around the corner from you. Yeah, safety, right? But also culture. And I think sometimes that's not injected in the conversation, but in a city like Chicago, where our international reputation is based on a level of culture that is unmatched in most American cities, we should be foregrounding that more as a selling point. Yeah, so that part. But I think as a media maker on multiple platforms, I feel like our role should continue to be to amplify and platform people who are creatives and are doing these things to make Chicago feel like an exciting, vibrant place. I think about my book where it's, in the very beginning of it, I quote a woman by the name of Leslie Guy who came here from Philadelphia. And what she said to me was, the thing about Chicago is it always feels like it's on the verge of spring, meaning that spring has not come yet, but it feels like something's about to happen. And I do think that feel like something's about to happen has gotten us really far. So I think we need to focus on what is possible if we stay in that mindset.
That cultivating that kind of anticipation, right? And just, it's a reminder that not all of the trends pertain to the built environment, that there's cities are more than the buildings and the infrastructure, right? But the programming and creating culture is not, you can create spaces for those things, but it's a lot more than that, a lot more sort of naturally
Right, a
involved.
feeling of belonging, a feeling like something is happening here.
Yeah.
Because how much of most people's job today is not happening IRL, right? So like what keeps you in physical community is these things and the spaces, but also this emotional tie.
Nick, you're a
Sure.
longtime native and Chicagoan.
Well, in his opening comments to this event, Sanjeev said that as planners, we look backward and we look forward, and that has to be our disposition. And I guess I approach this question with that same perspective. Have you all noticed that every single map of Chicago looks the same? Sure you have. Whether we're talking about economic development or public health, housing conditions, income inequality, or I could go on and on. Every single map looks the same. And if we look back 50 years ago, we'd see essentially the same picture. Within the social sciences, we have a concept called path dependence. The simple version of that is history matters. I think a slightly more interesting version is that past decisions begin to condition what happens in the future. And so when we look at past decisions around investment, around policy choices, around institutional arrangements, all these begin to influence what's possible. Maybe it is that it's almost springtime in Chicago, but whether spring comes and what kind of climate it's going to be like is going to be conditioned on those policy choices. Those policy choices and those institutional arrangements, those decisions have self-reinforcing effects. They have feedback effects on the system, and they shape the choices that are made in the future. And so in many ways, if you look back 50 years, and I'm afraid as we start to look forward, we see that a development path has been set. Now, path dependence doesn't mean that we can't change this. It doesn't mean that spring will never come. But what it does mean is that we need to have ruptures to those institutional arrangements. We have to have ruptures to those systems. What it means is that incremental change won't be enough to rupture those interlocking systems. It means that the trickle-down economic development that we've practiced in Chicago for so long, an economic development that favors certain neighborhoods or the downtown area with the idea that it'll trickle out to the south side and west side communities, that's not going to rupture the system. And so as I look forward, we're going to have to think about making hard choices about long-term investments. It's not as if previous mayoral administrations haven't tried to change these patterns, but we have to stay with it long enough to change the system and to change that map of Chicago. Because if we do not, it is going to continue to perpetuate the inequalities that we all know exist in the city and have existed in all of our lifetimes. And it threatens our prosperity, well-being, and everything else we care about in this city moving forward.
So there are certain things that are entrenched, right? And that, I think also echoing what Jeffrey was saying in his opening keynote, just that there's a kind of accretion of, one key, radical disruption takes place or a decision takes place, and then we have other kind of reinforcing decisions that kind of build on that. It's almost like I often use the metaphor of a coral reef, right? Like a little seed gets planted and then that grows, but then there are other places that do not. I guess I want to turn back to the question of, how much power or agency do city governments, say, have to both address these trends that are coming, right? We can't deny that we see the warming of the Earth's surface, or we see, an uptick in dramatic weather events and climate change. How well do you think the city of Chicago is both sort of tracking these future trends, kind of keeping an eye out for them? Is the public sector still a kind of caretaker or, looking out for the future? We think of that's really historically, that's where most planners have found jobs. That is not the case necessarily anymore, but they've gone to work for the local state, for municipal governments, and we've sort of trusted local governments to, have our best interests in mind and to be looking out for the future. Do you think that's still the case today? Does the public sector still play that kind of future-oriented role? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Nina and Marissa, you both just came from some stints in local government. What do you think?
We had a great time.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, and spending the last decade before coming to CNT in government and starting my career in government, I think was one of the most influential, informative things I could have done for my career and trajectory of change. I didn't grow up wanting to be a bureaucrat. I grew up very distrustful of government. I always say this, and I say this to my students, planning is a tool of white supremacy, and we have to undo the harms of the past as we join this profession. And even for me, calling myself a planner is a political act, because I want people to look at planning as something that is not just a white male-dominated industry. There are people like me. I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm a woman, I'm a millennial, I am a leader. I have a lived experience that is different than the people before me. And I wanted to infiltrate this system and start to undo the harm that I was subjected to growing up in my environment in Detroit. And going to planning school in California was really formative for me. Working for the city of Los Angeles and then coming to the city of Chicago was also really formative to me, because I got to see how these two massive cities work on creating change in meaningful ways. And I would say the biggest asset in both of those constructs was people power and kind of playing that inside-outside game. So yes, there are going to be some of you who will join our profession. I hope you take it seriously. I hope you actually understand how racial equity is at the basis of everything that we do. I don't believe that we are a neutral profession. We have ethics and we have a moral code in order to inform and better our communities, and I don't think you should join my profession, and I'm saying this intentionally, I don't think you should join my profession unless you have similar values to that and are ready to be called into action on that. I also think that it's important for us to both be on the inside to understand how the structure and the system currently works in order for us to burn it down and build it back up. And then I also had a coalition of people on the outside supporting me, and that's how I got introduced to the Center of Neighborhood Technology, working on the equitable transit-oriented development work that we are working on with Elevated, working on the ETOD policy plan and getting that passed by CPC, and then when I became the Chicago Recovery Plan Director, $250 million, 11 programs, 0 staff at first, and building that up to a team of 19, I could not do that alone. I did it in coalition with these outside partners. And so I think, yes, there is a place for us to infiltrate these systems, and I do mean infiltrate because there are a lot of people who are in the system whose entire mission is to keep it the status quo. And so I do think there is a place for a new generation of planners to go into government, but I also think there is also a very well-articulated place for people who are in nonprofit work and at private firms, and specifically for the Center of Neighborhood Technology, an organization full of planners, full of very articulate professionals who are thinking about and have a little bit more freedom than I did when I was in the city of Chicago. And so playing that inside-outside game to say, hey, I'm one voice in this conference room. Can you yell a little bit louder from the outside? And then that'll give me a little bit more momentum, and that's how it works. But again, I was coming into it saying I'm going to make allies and make relationships with outside partners, not because I need something, but because I'm truly in community. And I'm truly trying to help the other little Ninas of the world have more opportunities than I did. You should be able to thrive in the city that you were born in if you choose to. And the fact that that's not the case, I think, is a testament to the failings of our profession, but that's okay, right? We all play a part in saying we are here to atone for the things that happened in the past. And so, yes, I do think there is still a very specific role, an essential role for government, but we need to change what that leadership in government looks like. There needs to be more people with open-minded, progressive ideas who are willing to put in the work and change the systems.
So Nina and I both shared the joys of the 10th floor of City Hall.
Yes.
And I really agree. It was one of the great privileges of my life and in my work to be able to work for the city. I think it's really, really important work. It was the most meaningful and impactful work that I've been able to do, and I've been fortunate to do lots of meaningful and impactful things. So I can't speak highly enough of that decision. From a practical standpoint, I'll also just note that Chicago is one of only 3 cities that gets its own allocation of affordable housing tax credits. Most of the national low-income housing tax credits go to states. Well, it goes to all 50 states, and then there's these 3 exceptions. So there's an incredible amount of power, actually, at the local level in Chicago that is unusual to be able to set a vision and a policy frame for where and how we think affordable housing should exist in the city of Chicago, which was incredibly exciting to be able to not just have a thesis about how we think affordable housing should be distributed more equitably around the city, but then to actually have some of the most important tools we have to be able to do that. So, you know, my view by the time I left, I would sum up as you can't just put affordable housing where it's the cheapest to build it or where people will protest the least.
Yeah.
You have to put it where it's needed, which is everywhere. And thankfully, you know, Chicago's got some power to actually enact that, and we made a lot of progress on that. And we had a mayor that was very committed to making those decisions based on the criteria and the vision we had for the entire city, which I'm really grateful for. The other thing I would say, similar to Nina's point, just, you know, to people in the, there's a really importantly symbiotic relationship of people outside of government working with people inside government. And it can often seem very contentious, and it can be contentious. It's also super, super useful. I mean, it is true that that inside government, your thinking is fairly limited to 4 years at the most. You, as an individual, are trying to think further than that, but those are the constraints that you're under, right? And it takes people outside saying, I'm holding all of you accountable to a longer vision, to longer term outcomes than that, because that's, I don't experience my life in Chicago in 4-year increments, and so I'm gonna force you to think about this differently, plan differently. And so I do really wanna encourage that kind of civic activism that says, I've got a longer term vision, that reminds people in government that, hey, we just finally did a citywide plan again, let's actually use it. And that does more than just be snarky on Twitter, right? Like, actually get out there, figure out what are the limitations, and then work with people around them to really get things done. It is, as Nina said, like, as someone on the inside, I was like having these sidebars where it's like, please say that louder, because I need to be able to say I'm being held accountable to this outcome. So it is really necessary. It's not always that it's a conflictual thing.
Yeah, can I just jump in here? I mean, you know, I think when Rachel's students made their list of the maladies that are affecting us as a society, one of them was the state of our politics in this country. And I think one of the things that they were getting at was that there is an anti-urban bias in much of our national politics. And what I take away from that is that nobody is coming to save us. And so what we need to do in that environment is to do exactly what Nina and Marissa, I think, were talking about. I mean, Marissa talked about setting vision, and we need a vision not just for housing, but in all areas of our social life. And then we need the hard work that Nina and Marissa were both talking about to try to sway those. But there is no relief that's coming. If we do not figure it out as the city of Chicago, and our institutions and our organizations, no one is going to figure it out.
It was nice to have some of those ARPA monies or some of those federal monies sort of flowing in, and now for the pandemic, and now we're kind of back to square one, right? It's kind of like a high, like a sugar rush, and then or the tide, right? And then it kind of goes out again, and we're left with the resources we have, the sort of skeleton of the public sector, this very active set of civic organizations and nonprofits, and individuals. I guess, Ayanna, I want to ask you too. I mean, you work for a publicly nonprofit organization that also, in the same way, there's a parallel with what Marissa was talking about, where Chicago was the only city that had sort of its own individual allocation, or one of the few that had its own individual allocation of low-income housing tax credits because of interesting historical path-dependent kinds of reasons. We also have one public radio station, and think about
WFMT is technically public radio, but
Okay.
it's classical music. I just gotta,
Okay.
you know,
but in terms
it's not an NPR affiliate.
In terms of cultural institutions, how do you see the scene, and what role do these kind of legacy institutions have to play?
Right. So I think there's been a lot of change. I don't know if you've been on Twitter, but there's been a lot of change with WBEZ and Vocalo, one of which is that they're phasing out the Vocalo broadcast and laying off people, yada, yada, yada. The thing about Vocalo, going to your point about holding people accountable, WBEZ was founded in, I believe, 1945, Board of Education station. It was one of the original chartered NPR stations back in Z-Day. And in the year of our Lord, 2005, there was a Slover-Linette study that determined it was doing a really bad job of reaching younger people, people of color, and generally the majority of the population of the city. I mean, it's a majority minority city, then and now. Okay, so they're like, what are we going to do? So they literally started a second service, which is basically unheard of in the system, that is specifically targeting, like a 24-hour service that is reaching these people. We did all the groundwork. We met a whole lot of people who did not know what WBZ was, but told them that we're doing this community station for you. Fast forward 17 years, that's no longer part of the, part of what they want to accomplish now. They believe that their future is in providing news, which I think is important. Everybody here knows, right, like that a centrist news organization is more important than ever. However, back to my original statement, what Vocalo was doing for a generation of people was making it feel like they could have a life here and that they belong here.
Mm-hmm.
And the other benefit of it, from my perspective, because I ran Vocalo until very recently, was that we were able to disseminate information that otherwise was unavailable to populations of people that needed it the most. So like, let's say WBZ does an amazing like expose series about, let's say lead pipes or something. How do you get it to people who live in buildings that are impacted by that? So we'll have the reporter on and we'll break it down. We produced a show called The Barbershop Show on the west side of Chicago.
That's great.
Sorry.
Okay.
We did a lot of things that I think were really valuable. And the reason why I'm still kind of emotional about it is they announced this literally last week, if you didn't hear this. But what I'm saying is I think that the role of media in all of this is, yes, dissemination of information, keeping people accountable, keeping people informed so they can be accountable and be better citizens. And I think as we are in a very precarious situation with local media, it's really frightening, actually, really trying to figure out how to remain viable and sustainable. I think the nonprofit model, in a lot of ways, is gonna be where a lot of that local stuff that isn't necessarily gonna make millions of dollars should live. So if the nonprofit stations start moving towards a profit-motivated model, then where do these things live and thrive for people? That's really a question that I can't answer, but it does seem to be kind of like where things are going.
Now, if we see the local government having, as Marissa said, a sort of more, electorally driven time horizon, we're often looking to the nonprofits to keep us honest, to focus the local government on accountability, and to be looking into that future, and to be in many ways kind of bringing the next generation along with. But nonprofits, as we know, are some of the most fragile organizations in our society. They live and die by the largesse of philanthropies and other institutions and other levels of government. If nonprofits are supposed to be the vanguard, maybe leading us into the future, how do we support the nonprofits? Nina?
Yes.
You're
That's
leading
a great
one
question.
right now.
Go to cnt.org
Yeah, okay, okay.
/donate.
Send money.
No, I think, leaving government for me and going into the nonprofit sector was about having more opportunity to be innovative. So that's what the nonprofit sector really has, is to think outside the box, not be constrained by the structure that government is. And obviously government makes the decisions, but also like having the ability, like at CNT, we have an urban analytics arm, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find another nonprofit who has in-house coders and people who are creating tools and doing analytics and thinking about impact of investment like in-house, and that's really beautiful. But yeah, we are at the whim of philanthropy and of government contracts, and a third of CNT's government actually goes back out to CBOs, because what we do is we take the administrative burden, because CNT has been around for long enough and we kind of understand how these government contracts work. So we take the administrative burden for the CBOs that we work with, because if they had to do it on their own, they would never see any of this money come from government. They would almost, and even from philanthropy, it can be a little bit laborious for them if they don't have an accountant, or it's just a 1 or 2 person operation, or they're more kind of grassroots oriented. And so that's a part of our pedagogy, and what we explain to our funders and what we explain to our government partners is that we're losing money on this contract, but we take it as part of our financial mission we know we're going to lose money on your contract because of your indirect rates. If there's anybody from government who wants to talk about indirect rates, love to talk to you. But it's more meaningful and has more impact for community and direct service for us to do that. And then we go to philanthropy and we tell that story. And we say, this is where we have a gap, can you support us? And sometimes that story resonates with them, and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, it is a difficult balance, but I think a very necessary one. And I hope for anyone who goes into philanthropy or works at government, they understand the need for organizations like CNT, in which we are a think and do tank. So we do the research, we create the tools, we do the engagement, we do the capacity building for these organizations, and we can actually implement and build things like we're doing in Cook County right now with our Rain Ready program, in which they had a $6 million ARPA grant. But again, our community organizations can't handle the administrative burden of that. But we're going to see green stormwater infrastructure be built with that, right? In these South suburban communities, that without CNT being the stopgap, that wouldn't exist, right? And that's an important story to tell. And then we're also coaching our elected officials and the kind of policy makers, while also uplifting community voices. It's kind of like our data, what we call a data-informed approach, in which we have our data points, because we are data scientists, but also the qualitative part is just as important. And for our urban flooding baseline map, for example, where we know that there are gaps in the data, because FEMA data says one thing, then you have private insurance saying another thing, but it doesn't actually tell the complete story of flooding in Chicago. And so what we did is we paid residents to take pictures of that flooding that's happening happening, data points that aren't, again, being captured by these other two entities. And that way we were able to tell a more complete story to advocate, hey, you know, WMRD, this is where you need to be putting your time. This is where you need to be putting your energy. These are the places where it's flooding and actually impacting everyday life that you wouldn't see on a map. And that's the part that nonprofits can play. And again, talking to both the elected officials and the policymakers, but bringing the communities who know their problem, right? So we're not educating them on anything. And they know that where the problems are. They know that this has been, that flooding has been a problem, but nobody wants to listen. So again, we're able to translate that and actually come out with something actionable. So yeah, it's important to support the nonprofits doing work in this space because we're elevating the impact that would otherwise not be there.
Nick and then Marissa.
Yeah, I'm glad Rachel mentioned nonprofits. I enrolled in the Masters of Urban Planning program in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC in the late 1980s. And in the earlier part of that decade, we were coming off a period of incredible vibrancy within the nonprofit world. Marissa mentioned the importance of developing a vision, an alternative vision for development in this city. That's exactly what those organizations were doing. I'm talking about organizations like CNT, the Community Workshop on Economic Development, organizations in the Uptown neighborhood, organizations in Kenwood, Oakland, and so on. All over the city, those organizations were generating ideas just as Nina was describing. And what was important was during the Harold Washington administration, those ideas were being propelled into local government. They were changing the way we were doing things. Then a period of stagnation, I would say, occurred. I'll put it mildly, and a lot of those organizations receded. Some of them went out of business, but we lost that generation of the generation of innovation and ideas and vision that are so needed. So needed, I think, if we're going to actually have the springtime in Chicago. You could probably tell I'm a pretty pessimistic person, but the little bit of optimism that I have is that I feel like we might be in one more of those moments again. I do feel that those organizations are beginning to emerge and to put forward visions that challenge the state of affairs. In the area that I work, which is mostly around labor and employment, you know, I look at organizations like the Chicago Workers Collaborative or Arise Chicago, which have come up with ideas and seen them move into City Hall with whole new agencies that are looking at ensuring our workers' rights. I look at organizations like Equity and Transformation on the West Side that launched its own guaranteed income program. Now, hopefully, those ideas are going to be taken up by the Johnson administration in Chicago and by the Pritzker administration in Springfield and so on, and many other organizations starting to move a different vision for what we can be.
Yeah, that was surprisingly hopeful and optimistic.
Yeah, I know. It all got into me. It's Nina and all them getting to me.
Wearing off on him. Marissa.
Yeah, I wanted to return to one thing you said, Rachel, because I think it's very forward optimistic, actually. You talked about how there was a flood of federal money because of COVID, and there was, and the difference between preparing for my first budget in the city compared to the budgets once that money was there was night and day. And it was, for everyone, people didn't even know how to flex these muscles. What do you mean I have more money? Like you want me to know how I would spend it? I'm more used to defending what I have than I am like ideating about something. So that was great. It is getting spent down as it's supposed to be. But one thing I actually was reflecting on walking through campus. I used to come maybe once a semester. My friend Brenda Parker's do like a guest lecture in her class, and I was always end up getting asked about TIF and you know how inequitable TIF is, and why do we do this, and why are we set up this way, right? You've done a wee bit of work on this, Rachel. And what's interesting is that I think we've finally reached a point where the negatives of TIF and the inequities that they create and perpetuate I think have finally reached a point where there's a willingness to function the way lots of other cities function, which is not to set up such an inequitable system that's so based on geography and increment that geography produces, but instead to say we have citywide needs, and we want to set up criteria to spend investment dollars based on that criteria, not based on arbitrary geographic lines. And so there is a proposal right now being considered by council to let a whole bunch of TIFs expire and move much more into economic development bonds, which we did pilot in the last administration. So if you live in the city, call your alder and please tell them to support it, because it's coming, I think it may come to council this month. But it would be, thinking about equitable ways to plan for the future of this city, this would be a huge step forward and quite transformational in the ability to make decisions very, very differently.
Ayanna, I'm wondering too, if money was no object, right? In the decisions that have just transpired over the last couple of days with Vocalo, budgetary reasons were provided for why the...
That's what they said.
That's what they say. But could you imagine, flex that imagination to think about if money was no object, what would like an equitable and innovative culture industry look like? Like, where are the places that are really starving right now? What kinds of institutions or organizations could really use that kind of, whether it's an investment from an outside entity or from local philanthropies, or what would a more robust Chicago culture, institution, industry kind of thing look like?
Interestingly enough, I may be somewhat optimistic about this. In that, I think that culture is alive in Chicago, right? It just happens to be who gets the shine and who gets the acknowledgement tends to be a fairly small circle. One of the things that I have a big beef with is that the way things are set up right now, many of the cultural makers live in sections that are not being monetarily benefiting from cultural business transactions, i.e., I don't want to crack down on the city per se, but Vocalo actually published a piece talking about how few late liquor licenses were established or given to on the South and West sides, which would enable late night clubs and DJs and all these other things that people really kind of like to do and spend money at. And the outcome of that is there's these kind of illegal late night things happening that are getting cracked down by the police and yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, I think being thoughtful about that and engaging, asking these questions of why this is happening and what the real end game is something I think that could be very beneficial. Taking off my culture hat right now, the thing that really disturbs me, speaking of inequity in general, is that there isn't really a understanding of what's really happening in terms of population change in Chicago on a general level, meaning I'm specifically very concerned about the Black middle class, who has historically been comfortable enough to be active enough in the community to help keep things stable, right? And those people are like, yo, I don't even have a grocery store, this is ridiculous. I have a house that I've essentially paid off and I have nothing to show for it in terms of what's going on in my community. I'm out. And that change, if this continues at this rate, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years, basically the South and West Side would be cored out, and then that tax base is gone, and then we know what happens, right? And we're not talking about it we're talking about a lot of different things, but that particular population is super, super, super crucial. I'll give one small example. Until very recently, I lived in South Shore, as do a whole lot of people, a lot of movers and shakers and people just trying to make it. It's a very mixed income neighborhood. during 2020 when there was all the uprisings, the young people were going to try and bust out the grocery store, like loot the grocery store. And the older people who had seen the sort of narrative arc of not having a grocery store in our neighborhood for 7 years, they were like, you don't want to do this. Please don't do this. Let me explain all the reasons why. All these old people, they don't have anywhere else to go. And they stopped it.
Yeah.
Just the little things, I think, being mindful of that can really help, I don't know, stop the erosion that I'm very concerned about.
You bring up a good point about sort of intergenerational relations, and I think, and this will be the last question for you all, but I mean, I think Nick and I are kind of the same age. You guys seem a little bit younger. When we think about the future, it's not going to be our world to change anymore. It's going to be the next generation. So I guess I'm thinking about the extent to which, you know, when you think of your own sort of personal leadership journey, or you think of sort of, you know, the next 10, 20 years, how are you helping to cultivate that next generation that is going to lead us into that future? Where are the sources of great new ideas, whether they're planners or they're creatives or they're nonprofit leaders? Where are they going to be coming from? And how do you think, if you have any ideas about how best to sort of ensure that they stay in the game and that they don't abandon the city?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have something, or you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm also on the board of I'm on the national board of the American Planning Association. I have been, sometimes to my peril, very involved in APA since I was in grad school.
Thank you.
And lots of people ask me, Nina, why are you involved in APA? Like, you know, and it's one of those things where it's like, I love it so much I can critique it. And I think even when I was in my first board meeting in New Orleans last month, and I was the youngest person in the room, and you know, Angela Brooks, who's my mentor, the only other Black woman in the room, and I was telling that room, you know, I said, if we do not diversify and attract new members, our organization is going to die. We have to, and what it means to attract new members means to stop perpetuating the status quo. There is a generation of planners who do not want to continue to perpetuate the same BS we have been perpetuating, who want to talk about, who want to have the tough conversations, who are trying to decolonize how we think about urban planning, and we should be lifting those leaders up. I should no longer be the youngest person in the room. Like I said, I'm peak millennial, but I also understand there's lots of young leaders who are coming up the ranks who have things to say, and they should have a place in APA to do that. Even for me, I'm also appointed to the CMAP board, which I really enjoy. I see the CMAP folks over there. And often I am the only, you know, kind of person kind of pushing those progressive thoughts, saying like, hey, as long as I'm here until somebody kicks me off, I'm going to vote with my values and I'm going to call out my fellow board members on theirs. I think it's about creating opportunity. I've been honored to teach a course here at UIC called Leading for Change, which is in the CUPA. Which is in CUPA, but it's a leadership course because they don't teach leadership skills, and it shows. It shows. I've been high up enough in Los Angeles and Chicago to show, you know, people get to places without actually having leadership skills. It is easier. I never had the privilege of mediocrity, so you know, and I'm saying that half-hearted, but also it is very true. You have to start developing leadership skills of our young people early so that they understand what is emotional intelligence. How do you talk persuasively? How do you get people to change their minds? How do you meet people where they are? How do you make friends when you don't need them? These are all things that I'm teaching in my class that you all should take next year when it's offered. Shameless plug. But these are things that I do. And then if you know me personally, you know, again, I'm mentoring anybody who comes to me, especially somebody, a person of color who's interested in being a planner, I'm wrapping my arms around you and I'm giving you the resources that I have because people did that for me. And I think it's about showing people that planners can look all sorts of ways. They can work in government, they can work outside of government, they can have artistic expression, and they can, you know, work in think tanks, and they can love data, and we all come with our own POV, and you should be leaning into your identity, not running away from it. And that is what I want people to understand and kind of understand about the future of our profession, because again, if we do not start decolonizing how we think about planning, our profession is not going to grow, and it will eventually, you know, die out.
Thank you. Other thoughts about the future generations, the youth?
Yes.
I would say
The little
that
U's.
ultimately a lot of the policy choices that we make and strategic choices in a lot of institutions that exist, I can really speak for Chicago, I'm like fifth generation on one side, the other half we came up in the Underground Railroad, so I've been here for a minute. So what I could say is that it may serve a few people's pockets right now, but ultimately it is to the detriment of the metropolitan area as a whole, especially seeing what the projections of the population will be. So I guess people can think about, oh, I'm just thinking about me or my direct line or whatever, but if you want this city to be successful, right? Like we did really surprisingly well after the Great Recession, because it could have gone a lot of ways, as we all know. We just happen to have been diversified economically enough to not have gone down like a rock, like a lot of other cities. I hate to put it like that, but that's the reality. And we also didn't lose a ton of population, which is also important, but none of that is guaranteed in the next 20 years. Everything feels very fraught. Like, right? Thank you, I'm in a room where people know what I'm talking about. It is fraught. So we have to really not ascribe to status quo right now and be open to ideas. I too am often the youngest person in the room, and I am not young. You know what I'm saying? And they are not listening to me, but I'm hoping that they at least are opening their eyes and ears to what the canaries in the coal mines are actually saying right now.
Marissa, Nick, any comments? We have a little bit of time to take some questions from the audience, if we should. All right, I think there's some people out there with mics. So if you have a question, and maybe you could raise or shake your hand or even stand up. Yes, Maureen, up front.
I just wanted to comment on your comment earlier about keeping our activism aimed at our political officials. And I can remember when Harold Washington became mayor, and for a while there was this sort of tiptoeing around environment because everybody was so pleased and proud that we had a black mayor. And he had to come out and say, look, you got to shout at me and protest like you always did, because that gives me the grounds, as I think Marissa said, to go back in and say, well, look, you know, those people are mad at me. We got to do something about this. So I think that for people in the communities, you know, don't ever stop shouting and going to your officials, even if they're your cousin or your nephew or used to be your neighbor.
This is Chicago.
That's right. You've got to hold them accountable. And I also come from a generation of being involved in those community organizations that were out there on the street doing exactly that. And I learned as much from that experience as I did from UIC, and I am a graduate. But it was that combination. And I will say that when I was in planning school here, there was very much an attitude of respect on the part of the professors towards those of us sitting in the student chairs, that we knew sometimes as much as they did, if not more. And I thought that respect was really important. And that, you know, I would remember professors was saying, well, don't ask me about that. You know, talk to Maureen, she's sitting over there. She's been involved in a neighborhood organization for, 10 years. So I hope that, environment keeps up here at UIC, and that we respect our students' experience as well. And remember always what Harold said, don't stop shouting at me.
Don't stop shouting.
I will just say, I appreciate that, and you're right. I will say sometimes accountability doesn't always look like shouting, right? Sometimes, especially if you've got a welcome audience who's saying, yes, come in, let's sit down at the table, that's a different muscle. And sometimes people have not always developed that muscle, and that one is important too, because when you actually get a willing partner in a role and they're saying, yes, let's form this together. It doesn't mean you're not holding them accountable, but it looks very different than shouting from the outside. It looks like coming in, sitting at the table, compromising, pushing, see all of those things. So it's a range of things that are certainly needed. Shouting's one, but it's not the only one.
Other questions? One over here.
First of all, I just want to say hi, Nina.
Hey.
See you again. But I know you guys kind of touched on, this new generation of planners coming into this field, trying to change things up. And I kind of want to have, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like, how do we kind of bridge that generational divide? Because I know the planners that are currently there, a lot of them, have been here for a long time. They have a wealth of knowledge. Some of them have, actively tried to harm communities and definitely, do some damage, while others are, very afraid of maybe, being, oh my God, I was wrong. I'm obsolete now. Like, I don't want to let go of that. I know that's very scary for people. But at the same time, like, you have a wealth of knowledge that I can, like, utilize, learn from your mistakes so that those aren't repeated. Like, even now, like, there are ideas that I have, and then I talk to some of my coworkers that have been at my agency here for a while, and they're like, oh yeah, we already did that. It didn't work. You can try again, but this is another way to maybe go about it. Like, so it's kind of like, how do we kind of bridge that generational knowledge gap so that we can learn from each other's mistakes, not repeat them, while also allowing people to say, it's okay that you were wrong. Acknowledge that so that we can fix that. So yeah, that's my question.
That's a really good one. And I think for CNT, even coming in an organization that has been around for 45 years and that has a lot of established history of what we've done and amazing things, and then I'm also thinking about being the new kind of leader, what direction do we want to go to? And I think for me, and this is where leadership development is super important, and so that whether that be at CMAP or any organization, it's about creating an environment in which people feel like they can contribute ideas, kind of be honest, calling people in instead of calling people out, and establishing some guardrails and some very clear expectations. I think even for CNT, we're going through a strategic plan, but before I can get to the strategic plan, I'm like, oh, we need to kind of reassess our mission and vision, but establish value statements and have definitions with those value statements so that we can use that to make the strategic plan. Because if we don't even know or can succinctly say what our values are, then we can't create a strategic direction. And I have people who are my Gen Zers, and then I have my Gen Xers and my Boomers, and one topic, completely different attitudes about how to solve the problem. And I think it's about creating a space not to, that everybody will agree, but to create consensus. Oh, and don't even mention the board, right? So I got my staff, and I got my board, and I think it's just about, again, creating space to come to us having some real difficult conversations, but a leader who is nimble enough to make those conversations impactful and actionable, and then moving in a direction that we can all say, okay, I buy into this vision. It's like planning internally, but we think so externally about about the environment that we're impacting that we hardly think about using those same practices internally at our organizations, which is impeding our impact. If your house, I say this all the time, if your house, and my staff, they over there, y'all tired of hearing me say this, if your house is not in order, you cannot do your best work. And CNT is already doing amazing work, but just imagine once we find a strategic direction, we kind of reframe how far you can go. And I would encourage all of you to be thinking about your organizations like that. And you don't even have to wait for your leader to say, let's do this. You can say, hey, I think, on this particular topic, I've heard from 5 different people, and there's 5 different vantage points on this. We should probably get together in a meeting and whiteboard some solutions. Like, don't feel like you have to wait for somebody to help you get there. Like, be proactive, ask questions, be kind of curious about other people's thought. Practice proactive and active listening to people even that you disagree with, because I think it helps to it helps to open up your doors. And then the last thing I'll say is that I always talk about bringing your full self and leaning into your identity, because I do think leaning into people's identity helps to tell a complete story about a person. So it's not just Jim who says no to everything, but tell me, Jim, what about your background? Tell me how you grew up. Tell me this, tell me that. And then I can start to say, oh, this is why you're so structured, or this is why you don't want to change, and then I can start pointing those things out and say, well, this is how I grew up, and this is how I like to approach the problem. And it's hard to argue with somebody that you have a little bit more of an intimate connection with or understand more about their background. So that's what I would say, and that's what I've been actively practicing.
I think, real quick, as a historian person, I think zooming out, recognizing how much has changed in such a short period of time, and this is not an unprecedented level of change. Obviously, there have been short bursts of change in the way things have worked, definitely in the 20th century, incredible amount of change, right? But I think that a lot of folks who entered into this profession in the 70s and in the 80s, the world was a very different place, and understanding how much things have changed and how much the boots on the ground people's lifestyles have changed and what they actually need in a government, in society, in the amenities that they, need, has changed so much, and being open to thinking that even things that didn't work could possibly work now, right? Because I'm also one of those people who's very quick to look at kind of fancy initiatives from back in the day and actually, that could now, in these different conditions, could be worked out. So I'm saying this not to the youth in the room, I'm saying this to the seasoned in the room. I mean, just because something failed before doesn't mean you can't resurrect all the best parts of it and dust it off and put it back into the universe, because now might be the moment, because we've got to try everything. I'm not trying to be that person, but yeah, we got to try everything.
But sometimes I think it's sort of a natural part of that sort of arc where the older you get, maybe the more jaded you get and the more quick you are to say, we tried that and it didn't work. But I think what we're hearing is that kind of openness to because there's a lot of cool new ideas coming from the young people. I mean, right? The kids are all right in many ways.
We had cordless phones. We had no cordless phones, let alone cell phones. So I mean, a lot of, you know what I'm saying? I remember when we got our microwave.
So I'm being told that we've got to wrap this up, and it's a good note to end on, the sort of thinking about next generations and the radical ideas that are coming from younger people today. So I just hope, I wanted to thank you all. First of all, you're amazing presenters and speakers. Ayanna, Nina, Marissa, Nick, thank you so much. I hope that we are able to sustain and grow the wonderful ideas that you have launched into the world, the energy you have given, and the beauty that you have created, that there's a next generation to carry the torch, and that you have many more years doing the wonderful work that you're doing in this great city. So please join me in thanking the panel.